What you're about to see comes from a GoPro held by a man sitting at the open flap of his tent in Daniel Boone National Forest. He wasn't sleeping, he was waiting. For 3 nights, he'd heard something circling his camp after midnight, heavy footsteps, breathing, the sound of weight settling onto the picnic table 20 feet from his tent. On the 4th night, he didn't zip the flap. He sat in the dark with his GoPro and pointed it at whatever came out of the trees. A werewolf, standing upright at the picnic table, looking directly at him, and neither of them moved for 12 minutes. So, before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. The man in this footage is ex-infantry. Late 30s, grew up hunting whitetail in the hollows of eastern Kentucky before the Army took him overseas for 3 tours. When he came back, he didn't want noise. He didn't want bars or stadiums or crowded rooms where every exit needed to be cataloged before he could sit down. He wanted timber, ridgelines, the sound of creek water over sandstone at 3 in the morning when everything else has gone quiet. He found that in Daniel Boone National Forest. 700,000 acres of unbroken Appalachian ridge and hollow stretching across southeastern Kentucky. He'd been doing solo dispersed camping trips there for over a decade. No reservation. No maintained campsites. Just a truck parked at the end of a forest road, and a pack hauled into country where you can go a full week without seeing another human being. I've personally spent a lot of time digging into this region for trail stories, and what keeps coming up over and over is how much of it is just empty. Not empty like a field. Empty like something decided a long time ago that certain drainages and certain ridgelines belong to it, and everything else, the deer, the birds, the hikers, adjusted accordingly. The Forest Service manages the land, but there are parts of Daniel Boone that feel unmanaged in a deeper sense. Parts where the rules are older than the agency. The specific site he chose was off a decommissioned forest road about 9 miles from the nearest paved surface. He'd used it 3 times before over the past 2 years. It sat in a flat clearing at the bottom of a drainage where 2 ridges pinched together and a creek ran east through a gap choked with rhododendron and hemlock. There was a rusted fire ring that the Forest Service stopped maintaining years ago, and a weathered picnic table with 1 cracked plank on the bench side. Dense second-growth hardwood surrounded the clearing on 3 sides. The creek drainage opened up on the 4th. He liked the spot because it was defensible in the way his brain still processed landscape. One approach that funneled 3 walls of timber, good sight lines from the tent to the fire ring. He'd set up there in April, in October, and once in late December, when the ground was frozen and the canopy was stripped bare. Nothing unusual had ever happened. Deer at dawn, a barred owl calling from the ridge above. The usual inventory of an Appalachian forest doing what Appalachian forests do. This trip was early November. He drove in on a Thursday afternoon, parked at the gate where the road turned to gravel and then to nothing, and hiked the 2 miles to the clearing with 50 pounds on his back. He pitched his tent 20 feet from the picnic table, hung his food bag on a line between 2 oaks, built a fire in the ring, and cooked a meal as the light bled out of the sky. Standard protocol, everything by the book. He went to sleep around 10. The forest settled into its night sounds, the screech owl that always seemed to work the same stretch of canopy, the creek running over rocks, wind pushing through the bare upper branches in gusts that came and went like breathing. He slept well. He always slept well in the woods. It was the one place his brain turned off completely. At around 1:30 in the morning, something woke him. Not a crash, not a scream, a rhythm, a slow, repeating compression that sounded like weight being placed and lifted on wood. He lay still in his sleeping bag and listened. The sound was coming from the picnic table. Something was sitting on it, or stepping onto it, or shifting its weight back and forth on the surface. The rhythm continued for about 5 minutes, with a steadiness that ruled out wind or a falling branch. This was deliberate. This was something alive, choosing to be on that table in the middle of the night. Then it stopped. Silence held for maybe 10 seconds. Then footsteps. Heavy, slow, moving away from the table toward the tree line on the creek side. He counted the steps out of habit. The spacing was wrong. Too far apart for a human walking at that pace. And the cadence was two-footed, not the shuffling four-beat gait of a bear, not the quick tap of a deer. 2 feet, landing with the kind of impact that meant serious mass behind each stride. The footsteps faded into the drainage, and the forest sounds came back. The owl started calling again. The wind returned. Whatever had been on the table was gone. He got up at dawn and went to the picnic table. The first thing he noticed was the scratch marks. 4 parallel grooves gouged into the weathered surface, each about 6 inches long, running in the same direction. They weren't there when he'd eaten dinner. He'd sat at that table with his hands on it, and he knew the surface. These marks were new, deep, cut through the gray weathering into the pale wood underneath. The spacing between the 4 grooves was wider than his hand with the fingers spread. Not raccoon claws. Not bear claws. Something with reach. He checked the ground around the table. The soil was soft from recent rain, and he found impressions, but they were smeared, like whatever made them had shifted its weight repeatedly while standing in one place. He couldn't pull a clean track. What he could measure was the stride length between the clearest marks leading away from the table toward the creek. Over 4 feet. He paced it 3 times to be sure. Now, I personally think most people would have packed up right here. I would have understood that completely. But this man didn't come to the woods to feel comfortable. He came because the woods were the only place where the noise in his head went quiet, and he wasn't willing to surrender that to something he hadn't even seen yet. He'd spent years in places where the unknown could kill you, and the protocol was always the same. You don't retreat until you've identified the threat. You gather intelligence first. Then you decide. So he stayed. He spent the day doing normal camp things. Filtered water from the creek. Cut firewood. Walked a loop around the clearing to check for additional sign. He found nothing beyond the table marks and the smeared tracks. No scat. No fur caught on bark. No game trails that looked freshly broken. whatever had visited his camp, came in along the creek bed, spent time at the table, and left the same way. It didn't forage. It didn't hunt in the immediate area. It came specifically to the clearing where he was sleeping. That detail is what kept him there. A bear investigates a campsite because of food smells. A curious coyote passes through. But something that arrives on 2 feet, sits on a structure, leaves scratch marks, and then departs along the same route it came. That's not foraging behavior. That's visitation. And visitation implies intent. He changed his routine for the second night. No fire after dark. He ate early, cleaned every trace of food from the clearing, and got into his tent before sunset. He moved his food bag farther away, hanging it from a branch 100 yards down the creek. He wanted to remove every attractant. If the werewolf came back, it wouldn't be coming for the food. It would be coming for him. 2 a.m. The sound returned. He was already awake, lying on his back in the sleeping bag with his eyes open, listening to the forest, with the focus he'd learned in places where listening was the difference between living and dying. The werewolf arrived from the creek drainage side. He heard it stepping through the shallow water. Each step displaced water with a heavy splash that spoke of serious weight. Then up the bank, soil compressing, a branch snapping under a foot that didn't care about noise. Then the creak of the picnic table as weight settled onto it. He lay still. Through the thin nylon wall of the tent, he could hear breathing, not panting, not the rapid huffing of a winded animal. Deep, slow, rhythmic breathing. The kind of breathing that comes from a large chest expanding and contracting without urgency. The sound carried because the air was perfectly still. No wind. No owl. Even the creek seemed to have gone quiet, though he knew that was his perception narrowing, not the water stopping. The werewolf sat on the table and breathed for what he estimated was 10 minutes. Then it moved. He heard it step off the table. The footsteps came toward the tent, heavy, measured, each one deliberate. It stopped. He could hear the breathing from maybe 8 feet away, close enough that he could detect a secondary sound underneath the breathing. A faint wet clicking, like a jaw opening and closing slowly. His hand was on his knife. His headlamp was off. He counted heartbeats because counting kept his hands from shaking. 17, 18, 23, 31. The werewolf stood outside his tent for what he later estimated was 3 minutes. He could feel its presence the way you feel someone standing behind you in a room. A pressure, a displacement of air, a weight that the darkness seemed to gather around. Then it turned. He heard the footsteps move back to the table. The wood creaked again as it settled. It sat there for another 20 minutes. Then it left through the creek drainage with the same slow, heavy stride. No urgency, no alarm. It simply decided to go. He didn't sleep. He lay in the dark until dawn grayed the tent walls, then got up and went outside with a focus that felt almost clinical. The fresh tracks around the table were cleaner this time. Large canine paw prints, but wrong. The toes were elongated. The rear pad was too narrow for the overall size. And the prints transitioned. Near the table, they looked like the hind feet of something enormous walking on all fours. But at the spot where the werewolf had stood near his tent, the spot where he'd heard the breathing 8 feet from his face, the prints changed. The front feet were gone. Only the rear pair remained, deeper in the soil, carrying the full weight of something that was now upright. And next to those prints, pressed into the soft ground, he found the impressions that changed everything. 5 digits, spread wide, with claw tips at the end of each one. Not paws. Hands, functional, gripping hands pressed flat into the earth by something that had been standing on 2 legs and leaning forward to look at his tent more closely. I've been going back through Linda Godfrey's field research on this, and what she documents over and over in her case files from Wisconsin and Michigan is witnesses describing hands, not paws with dew claws that happened to splay. Hands. Proportional, articulated hands attached to forearms that bend at a wrist. The biomechanics of that shouldn't work on a canine frame, but the evidence keeps showing up. Godfrey has plaster casts from 3 different states that show the same structure, and now here it was in eastern Kentucky, pressed into mud outside this man's tent. He spent the 3rd day sitting at the picnic table in the daylight, thinking. He had his GoPro with him. He always carried it for time, lap shots of sunrise over the ridgelines. He tested it in night mode, setting it on the tent pole at the entrance and checking the frame. The picnic table was clearly visible at 20 feet. The infrared wasn't going to give him Hollywood resolution, but it would capture shape, movement, and the reflective eye. Shine that night, vision cameras pick up from animals. Anything upright and 7 feet tall standing at that table would register. His plan was simple. Tonight, he would not zip the tent. He would sit at the open flap with the GoPro in his right hand, braced against the tent pole for stability, and he would wait. No fire. No headlamp. No sound. Just him and the lens and whatever walked out of that creek bed after midnight. I want to be clear about something here. I personally think this was either incredibly brave or incredibly reckless, and I still haven't decided which, but I understand the impulse. When you've spent 3 nights listening to something that shouldn't exist at your tent, there's a part of your brain that refuses to walk away without seeing it. A lot of you have told me after previous videos that you've felt that exact pull. The need to know, even when knowing might be worse than not knowing. He settled into position at 11:30, sleeping bag draped over his shoulders for warmth. GoPro in his right hand, braced against the aluminum tent pole. Left hand resting on his knife, more out of habit than any belief that a blade would save him. The tent flap was pulled back and tied open with a length of paracord. He could see the picnic table as a dark rectangular shape against the slightly lighter mass of the tree line. The fire ring was cold. No moon. Cloud cover had rolled in during the afternoon and sealed the sky. The only light was the faint green glow of the GoPro's night mode indicator, which he covered with his thumb. He waited. The forest settled into its usual pattern. Screech owl on the ridge. Creek water. wind arriving and leaving. The occasional crack of a branch settling in the cold. Background noise. Baseline. At 1:47 in the morning, the baseline collapsed. Every sound stopped at once. The owl went silent. The wind died. The creek kept running, but even that seemed to drop in volume, as if the forest itself was pulling inward, holding its breath, making room for something that required silence. He kept the camera steady. From the creek drainage, he heard the water displacement, something stepping into the shallow channel. The splash was heavy and slow, then the sound of feet on the bank, climbing, soil compressing under weight that exceeded anything native to these woods. Each footfall landed with a sound like a fist hitting packed earth. 2 feet. Steady rhythm. Approaching the clearing with the confidence of something that had made this walk many times before. The werewolf entered the clearing. He couldn't see detail yet, just the shape. But the shape was immediately, viscerally wrong. It was upright. Taller than any man he'd served with, and he'd served with men who played college basketball. The shoulders were too wide for the narrow waist. The head didn't sit on top of the shoulders the way a human head does. It thrust forward, extended on a thick neck, with a muzzle that protruded from the skull in a way that was unmistakably canine. The werewolf moved with a fluidity that contradicted its size. Nothing that massive should move that smoothly. No wasted motion. No sway. Each step placed precisely. Weight transferred cleanly, as if the werewolf had been walking this particular path through this particular clearing for years and knew every root and stone by feel. The werewolf walked to the picnic table. It didn't sit on the bench the way a person would. It stepped onto the table surface itself and crouched there. The wood groaned under its weight, a deep stressed sound that made him think of green timber bending under a load it was never designed to carry. The werewolf settled into a position that was almost human. Knees drawn up, arms resting on them, but the proportions shattered the resemblance. The arms were too long, hanging past the knees when they should have stopped above them. The legs bent at angles that human knees don't accommodate, folding back in a way that suggested a digitigrade structure hidden under dense fur that covered the werewolf's body from shoulder to ankle. He kept filming. His hand was shaking. He could see the tremor later when he reviewed the footage. The image vibrates slightly, a human heartbeat translated into pixel movement. But he didn't lower the camera. He sat at the mouth of his tent, 20 feet from a werewolf, and held the shot. The werewolf turned its head toward the tent. He is looking at it. It is looking at him. 20 feet of dark air between them. He is holding a camera. It is crouching on a picnic table in a forest clearing where no one will find him for a week if something goes wrong. Neither of them moves. The GoPro's infrared caught the werewolf's eyes. In the footage, they appear as 2 pale points set wide apart on the skull, glowing with the reflective shine that tapetum lucidum produces in nocturnal predators. The night mode rendered the werewolf's body as a dark mass with visible texture. He could see the contour of fur covering the shoulders and upper back. Dense and dark, with a coarse grain that caught the infrared differently than the surrounding trees. The chest was broad and deep. The face was harder to resolve at 20 feet. The muzzle shape was unmistakable. Long. Canine. The ears were pointed and sat high on the skull, angled forward in a posture that in any canine species means focused attention. The werewolf knew he was watching. He was certain of that then, and he's certain of it now. It didn't flinch when it turned toward the tent. There was no moment of surprise. It had known he was awake every single night. It had known he was listening, and now it knew he was recording. And it sat on the table and looked at him with what he would later describe as patience, not aggression, not hunger, not the predatory focus of a wolf lining up a kill. Patience. The demeanor of something that has done this before and will do it again, and finds no threat or urgency in a man with a camera sitting in a nylon tent. The werewolf was not afraid of him, but it also wasn't hunting him. It was studying him the same way he was studying it. The standoff lasted 12 minutes. He timed it by the GoPro's internal clock. Then the werewolf did something that broke something inside him. Slowly, with a deliberateness that could not be mistaken for reflex, it tilted its head to the right at maybe a 20-degree angle. The way a dog tilts its head when it hears a frequency it's trying to locate or a sound it doesn't understand. But this wasn't a dog hearing a whistle. This was a 7-foot upright predator that had been visiting his campsite for 4 consecutive nights, and it was studying him with the same curiosity he was studying it. In that head tilt, he felt the entire narrative invert. He had been thinking of himself as the observer, the one with the camera, the one gathering intelligence. But the werewolf had been doing the same thing for longer and with more patience. The first 3 nights weren't random visits. They were reconnaissance. The werewolf had been listening to his breathing patterns, learning when he slept and when he woke, noting how he responded to sound, testing the perimeter of his awareness the way a field operative tests the security of a building before entering it. He was not the researcher. He was the subject. And the werewolf was simply allowing him to realize it. I want to stop here for a second, because I think this is the detail that separates this encounter from almost every other werewolf sighting I've covered on this channel. Not the size, not the eyes, the head tilt. Because a predator doesn't tilt its head at prey. That's not a hunting behavior. That's a cognition behavior. It means the werewolf was processing something about him that it didn't immediately understand. Which means it thinks. It reasons. It encounters information that doesn't fit its existing framework, and it pauses to recalibrate. That's not instinct. That's intelligence. And if a werewolf is intelligent in that way, genuinely reasoning, genuinely curious, then every assumption we have about what's out there in these forests needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. The werewolf held the head tilt for 3 or 4 seconds. Then it straightened. It stepped off the table in one fluid motion. Not a jump. Not a climb. Down. A smooth, controlled drop that absorbed the 3. Footfall in perfect silence. It stood upright beside the table for a moment, still facing the tent. The full height of the werewolf was visible now, backlit slightly by the difference in darkness between the tree line and the sky. 7 feet, maybe more. The legs were thick. The torso tapered from massive shoulders to a waist that was narrow for the overall frame. The arms hung at its sides with the hands slightly open. Then the werewolf turned and walked back toward the creek drainage with the same heavy, measured steps. It didn't look back. It walked into the trees the way a man walks away from a window he's finished looking through. Done for tonight. Not done permanently. He sat at the tent entrance until dawn. He didn't move. He didn't sleep. The GoPro battery died at around 4:15, and he sat there for another 2 hours in complete darkness, holding a dead camera aimed at an empty picnic table, listening to the forest come back to life, one sound at a time. The owl first, then the wind, then the full chorus of dawn. By the time the sun cleared the canopy, the clearing looked exactly as it always had. He should have left. He knew that. The rational part of his brain was telling him to hike to the truck and drive until the forest was small in his mirrors. But he had footage now, and the werewolf hadn't attacked. 3 nights of visitation without a single aggressive action. It watched. It studied. It left. There was a pattern here that his training recognized, even if his instincts screamed against it. So he stayed one more night. Same setup. Tent flap open. GoPro charged during the day off his solar panel. Camera in hand, braced on the pole. Night mode active. He settled in at 1:50, 2 in the morning. The werewolf arrived through the creek drainage. Same approach. Same heavy steps up the bank. Same crossing of the clearing. Same creak of wood as it settled onto the picnic table in the same crouching posture. He was filming. He was steady this time. The shaking was gone. His body had reached some accommodation with the fear, filing it somewhere beneath the surface where it couldn't interfere with the task. Then, a second shape entered the clearing. It came from the opposite direction. Not the creek. The ridge to the north. It moved lower to the ground, staying close to the tree line, using the shadow of the timber for cover. It was smaller, maybe 6 feet standing upright, though it didn't fully stand until it reached the edge of the clearing. Leaner build, faster in its movements, more cautious. A younger werewolf, perhaps an adolescent. The larger werewolf on the table turned its head toward the newcomer. A sound passed between them that he recorded but almost missed. It wasn't a howl. It wasn't a bark. It was a low vibration that sat below the range of easy hearing. He felt it in his sternum more than he heard it with his ears. A subsonic pulse that traveled through the ground and the wood and the air simultaneously. The smaller werewolf responded with a shorter, higher version of the same sound. Then both werewolves looked at the tent. He was now being watched from 2 angles. The larger werewolf on the table, directly ahead. The smaller werewolf at the tree line, off to his right. If this had been a coordinated kill, if these were predators running a pincer approach, this would be the geometry of it. 2 angles that prevent the prey from protecting both flanks. He recognized the setup because he had been trained in the human version of it. But the werewolves didn't move. They watch. The larger one in its patient crouch. The smaller one standing at the edge of the trees, motionless, except for the slow turning of its head as it looked from the tent to the larger werewolf and back. 20 minutes passed. He counted. He filmed. Then the larger werewolf stepped off the table and walked toward the smaller one. They stood together at the tree line for a moment, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The larger werewolf was a full head taller. It turned and looked back at the tent one final time. The infrared caught both sets of eyes, 4 pale points glowing at different heights, all aimed at him. Then both werewolves walked into the forest in single file, the larger one leading, the smaller one following 3 paces behind, matching the stride pattern exactly. They moved through the underbrush with a sound like heavy fabric dragged across leaves, and then the sound faded, and the forest filled the space they left behind. At dawn, he packed his camp. He didn't rush. He folded his tent with the same care he always used. He cleaned the fire ring. He coiled his paracord. When he passed the picnic table on his way out of the clearing, he stopped. He put his hand flat on the surface, right on the scratch marks, and held it there for a moment. He told me he doesn't know why he did that. It wasn't a goodbye. It wasn't a challenge. It was something closer to acknowledgement. He had been in their space. They had allowed it, and now he was leaving. He hiked out to his truck without incident. The forest was normal. Birds called. A squirrel ran along a branch overhead. The creek sounded the way creeks always sound. Nothing followed him. Or if it did, it let him go. He got home, sat down with a GoPro, and reviewed every frame. The night 3 footage was the strongest. The werewolf on the table was clearly visible as a large, dark, upright figure with canine head proportions and reflective eyes. The head tilt was captured. The 12-minute standoff was captured. The step down from the table was captured. Night 4 showed both werewolves, but the second one was farther from the camera and harder to resolve. Still, 2 distinct upright canine figures in the same frame, at the same campsite, displaying coordinated social behavior. That's not a bear. That's not a costume. That's not pareidolia. He didn't post the footage online. He drove to the nearest Forest Service ranger station and asked to speak with someone about unusual wildlife activity in the Daniel Boone backcountry. The ranger on duty listened to his description without interrupting. When he mentioned the upright posture and the handprints in the mud, the ranger went quiet, not dismissive. Quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from recognizing something you've heard before and don't want to hear again. The ranger told him he was not the first person to report unusual activity in that particular corridor, and gave him a phone number for a regional wildlife biologist. The biologist never returned his call. He tried 3 times over 2 weeks. No response. So, he did what I always do. I filed a FOIA request. Forest Service for campsite closure records in that drainage of Daniel Boone National Forest over the past 5 years. What came back was a set of administrative records showing 6 separate dispersed camping area closures in the same corridor. All 6 were filed under the same category, temporary area restriction due to bear activity. Here's what got me. 3 of those 6 closures were issued in December, January, and February. Black bears in Kentucky enter hibernation in late November and don't emerge until March or April. You can check the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife's own published data on this. Bears are not active in that forest during those months. They are in their dens. Whatever triggered those winter closures was not a bear. But the paperwork says it was, because the paperwork has to say something, and bear activity is the one category that automatically triggers a closure protocol without requiring additional investigation or public disclosure. A lot of you have asked me after previous videos why government agencies seem to default to bear as the explanation for things that clearly aren't bear behavior. I think this is the answer. It's not a conspiracy, it's a bureaucratic shortcut. If you file a report as bear activity, the system knows what to do. Close the area, post signs, wait 6 months, reopen. No questions, no press inquiries, no need to explain something you can't explain and don't want to try. File it as bear. Close the area. Move on. The Cherokee, who lived in what is now eastern Kentucky for thousands of years before European contact, have oral traditions about this exact kind of landscape. They described Sol Kalu, the slant-eyed giant, a being associated with high ridges and deep hollows. But there is a secondary figure in Cherokee tradition that gets less attention. A guardian of specific drainage corridors. A being with the body of a man and the head of a wolf that moves between the ridges at night and watches those who enter its territory without hostility, but without welcome. The Shawnee, who also inhabited this region before forced removal, described a similar figure in their own tradition. Both the Cherokee and the Shawnee placed these beings in specific types of landscape ridgeline drainage systems where water runs east. Narrow hollows where 2 ridges come close together and the canopy closes overhead. Places where sound carries differently and the air feels heavier than elevation alone would explain. The campsite where this man pitched his tent and filmed a werewolf crouching on his picnic table sits in exactly that kind of corridor. East, running water. Pinched ridgeline. Closed canopy. The indigenous people who knew this land for millennia before the Forest Service put a road through it would not have been surprised by what his GoPro captured. They would have expected it. They tried to tell us. We filed their warnings under mythology the same way the Forest Service files werewolf encounters under bear activity. He still camps. He went back to Daniel Boone National Forest 6 weeks later. Different site, different drainage. 15 miles south of the original clearing. Nothing happened. Deer at dawn. An owl at dusk. He slept through the night without incident. But, he says, the woods felt different after what he saw. Not threatening. Just aware. Like the forest had taken note of the fact that he'd crossed a line, and was waiting to see what he'd do with that knowledge. He kept the GoPro footage. He's shown it to 3 people. The first told him it was a bear standing on its hind legs, which is the answer people give when they need reality to stay inside the lines they've drawn for it. The second told him it was a guy in a suit, which is the answer people give when they need to believe that everything frightening is also fake. The third person watched the 12-minute standoff in silence from start to finish without a word. When it was over, the third person said, "That's not a bear, and that's not a costume, and I think you need to be very careful about who else you show this to." He showed it to me. I personally think the most important detail in this entire encounter isn't the footage. It's the head tilt. Because that one gesture tells you more about what werewolves are than 1,000 blurry trail camera photos ever could. A predator doesn't tilt its head at prey. It strikes. A territorial animal doesn't tilt its head at an intruder. It displays. The head tilt is what you do when you encounter something that interests you, something you need to look at from a different angle to understand. That werewolf was trying to understand him. And if it's trying to understand us, then it's been watching us for a lot longer than 4 nights at a campsite in Kentucky. It's been watching us for as long as the Cherokee and the Shawnee have been telling stories about the wolf-headed figure in the drainage corridors. And it has been patient. Far more patient than we are. Far more patient than we have any right to expect. If you've had an experience in Daniel Boone National Forest or anywhere in eastern Kentucky, I want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments or reach out to me directly. And if you haven't already, subscribe. We are just getting started with this region, and I think there's a lot more waiting in those hollows than any of us are ready for.